So welcome to the Every Copy Counts composing session. My name's Jenetta Hurst and I'm elated to be here this afternoon with Howard Goodall. We're going to get into some questions about how he works, his process in composing. So Howard is an English composer of musicals, choral music and music for film and television. His film credits include Bean the Musical, TV credits include Red Dwarf, Blackadder, Mr. Bean, The Vicar of Dibley, and The Catherine Tate Show. And musical theatre credits include Bend It Like Beckham, the musical. So good afternoon, Howard.
Hello, Jenetta, and hello, everybody else.
Marvellous to have you here with us. I'm going to jump straight into the questions. Our first question comes from a student, and Gabriel asks, what inspired you to become a composer?
Well, I guess I wanted to start writing music when I was about 9 or 10 years old, because I was in a choir and I thought this music's nice that I'm singing, but really what I'd like to do is see if I could write something that our choir could sing. And I think probably about a year or so, maybe by the time I was about 11, maybe 10, 11, the choir director said, well, you can write us a little piece and we'll sing it. And they did. And it was incredibly exciting. And I thought, well, I'd love to do more of this. So I started with what I knew, which was I sang in a choir. So I started writing choir music. And I also started writing things on the piano, which I was learning. And, you know, a friend of mine played the cello, so I wrote a piece for cello. So I started there. And then, of course, by the time I was about 14, I wanted to be a pop star like everybody else. So then I started to write songs at the piano.
Marvellous, thank you so much. And what was your route into composing?
Well, that's a good question, because I did it kind of in my spare time for most of the time. I just did it for fun. And then I started to have a little cassette player and record the songs I was writing onto that. You know, I would sing them into it and everything. And I would write lots of them. And, you know, I would just try and get better at what I was doing. And I kind of imagined that I would then send them off to somebody and they would say, you know, here's a record contract. It didn't quite work out like that. Although by the time I was 18, that had happened. And my friend and I, who were writing songs together, entered a talent contest. It wasn't a televised one like X Factor, but it was one run by a record company. And we won a prize, which was to make a record with them. And so I sort of started there, really, I suppose. And then I went to university. While I was at university, I had a band, and I started to get involved in doing the music for the comedy shows that other students were doing. And two of those other students were Rowan Atkinson and Richard Curtis, who both were doing comedy stuff as students, and I did their music for them with my band. And then when we all left university, they started making radio and TV comedy programs, and they said to me, why don't you come and do the music for that? And we used to tour, do live tours with the show, and we did TV eventually, and you know, built from there, really. So I don't think there was a moment where I said, well, this is how it's going to work. I think I just went from move to move. You know, I just met people who wanted a bit of music, so I said, well, I'll do that, and learnt as I went along. By the way, the pop star thing didn't quite work out, because we released an album and 2 singles, and we didn't have any hits.
Fantastic. Doesn't everyone want to be a pop star when they're a teenager? Every musician. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Marvellous. And another student question comes from Josna, and she asks, what was the first piece of music that you composed, which I think you may have alluded to already?
Yes, it was this piece for choir. It was very short. I mean, it was about a minute long. And I was asked to write. It was for a special occasion where our choir was singing a sort of big dinner event, and he said, could you write something that would be like an introduction to this, like a sort of vocal fanfare? So that's where it started. I was very young, I think, when it was 10 or 11, I think, but by then I was already writing pieces, you know, for what I could play, you know, piano pieces, etc. Not that they ever had a public outing, but when I was at secondary school, you know, I was able to perform some of my pieces in the school concert and things like that. And then when I was 16, I was at a large comprehensive school in Oxfordshire, and I was asked if I would write a musical for the 11-year-olds, about 120 of them in that year group. And so with a member of staff who wrote the words, we adapted a book called The Midnight Folk, and I wrote my first musical when I think I was 15, in fact, when I started to do that. And that was fantastically good fun. I loved doing that. And we took a whole term, learning all the songs and preparing it and rehearsing it, and it was put on at the end of the Christmas term. And so I did 2 more before I left school. We did 1 each year with the 11-year-olds, and I absolutely loved it. And I got a taste for writing musicals. Since then, I've done about 10 professional musicals, most of which have ended up in London at one stage or another. So it's been something that's been going on through my life, is writing musicals.
Fantastic. And I love the fact that started when you were in school, and that just brings to reality for the young people that will be watching this why it's so important just to take every opportunity that's available to them, whether they feel fully ready for it or not. Just go for it and give it a try. And also really wonderful to hear you talking about composing for a purpose, which a lot of the young people are asked to do now at Key Stage 4 certainly, but also in Key Stage 3, just composing to a brief and composing for a specific reason, and that can be a real starting point in moving on. So thank you for that. Another student fielded question from Naima, this one, and it says, we listened to your work in year 9 and analysed how you had set music to the airport scene in the movie Bean. How has your composing developed over the years from the 1980s to the present day?
What a good question, Naima. I mean, the thing is that every job makes you learn something new. That's what I've found, is that, that movie you saw, the one, Mr. Bean, everything going wrong, and he's at the airport and gets arrested, etc., etc. That was the first really big movie I'd done. I'd done about a dozen smaller scale movies, TV movies and things like that before that. And each one teaches you something different, because each story is different and all the characters are different and the situations are different and the mood is different. And I think it's really important when you start composing to adapt to what is the material or what is the occasion or what's the reason you're writing it for. The reason for that is it's much easier to do that than just to simply look at a blank page and say, I'm going to write a piece of music. That's really difficult, to just imagine something out of nowhere. But if someone says to you, here's this story, write some music for this moment in the story, then you learn, by trial and error, you find out what works. And the thing is with films, for example, is that you're part of a team. You're not really doing it on your own. You are trying to set music to each scene in discussion with the director and the producers, and sometimes also the stars of the piece as well. And you have a lot of discussion. You have to try things. Sometimes you try, 10 or 11 or more versions of each scene until everybody's happy that that's the right mood, that's the right pace. And learning to write for films in particular is very, very technical. There's a lot of technology you have to master, because you're doing something in very small details on the picture. And that technology has to be learned like everything else. You have to learn how to use the technology and to match music to picture very, very accurately, and be able to imagine what it'll sound like with a full orchestra, etc., etc. And I think that each job you do, every TV theme I've done for all those programs that Jenetta mentioned at the beginning, each one was a different requirement. Each had a different team of people to work for, and each one has a different story, different characters, different mood. So I think what you do is you learn along the way. And I think it's probably true to say that in the 1980s and 1990s, I spent maybe 80% of my time doing TV stuff, TV scores and TV themes. And when you do a lot of something, you start to understand the process much better, about what's required and how you have to be not precious about your work. If someone says it doesn't work, you just got to redo it. You can't just say, oh no, it must be like that. You've got to understand you're working in a team when you're working on television or film. And then I suppose it's true, since the 21st century began, I've done more and more choral music and more in musical theatre. It's kind of balanced out a bit like that. And they're all very different forms, and they require different skills that you've got to master. And by the way, no one who starts out composing age 14 or 18 or 25 knows all those things when they start. Literally nobody. You have to learn it along the way as you do the job.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you. There's so much in there. The thing that I want to just take away and highlight is this idea of 10 or 11 versions of the same piece of music we really try to encourage young people to have this idea of a composer's scrapbook and taking ideas and maybe putting them down and coming back to them and being willing to try things over again or try things in a different way. So thank you for highlighting that. That's fantastic.
And can I just add to that, Jenetta, that, I'm not 16 anymore doing it at school, but I am still doing it after 40 years as a professional composer. And even now, I still have to redo things. If someone else in the team isn't happy with it or it doesn't quite work for them, I still have to redo it. I still have to chuck stuff out and start again. It's something that goes on your whole professional career.
Fantastic. So valuable. Thank you so much. And this is a meaty question, probably for all students of GCSE and A-level music, from Elio. What is your advice on using harmony more effectively in composing?
Well, that's a very good question, because harmony can be deceptive. And the reason I say it can be deceptive is because sometimes one chord beautifully chosen in the right place can be incredibly beautiful, and you don't need to be very much more complicated than that. There's lots of music around the world which basically has very static harmony. The harmony stays quite simple all the way through, and other things like the rhythm and the melody become more interesting as a result. As a sort of compensation goes on. And if you put in too many chords and it becomes too obsessed with your harmony, you can make your piece of music a bit confused and a bit unrooted. And I say the word rooted because it isn't like plants. If you're planting a garden and you've got your soil and you make your seeds and you make your plants come up, one of the things that makes the harmony of a garden work is the things that are next to each other and placed side by side. And you might find a beautiful chord, but if it's in the wrong place, it's not going to work, because it's what comes next and what comes before it. When I was, at university, one of the things we were taught to do was look at the way that the composer J.S. Bach set the music, the harmonies, to these hymn tunes that he had to do as part of his job. And there are hundreds of them. And the extraordinary thing is that quite a few of those tunes are the same tune, which he reharmonized differently. So it sounds like a different harmony, a different tune, different hymn altogether, maybe 10 or 20 times. He could go on putting different chords under the same melody, and they all worked. And it showed you, what it demonstrated to you is that harmony is like movable blocks, is that you've got a huge amount of choice at any one time, and you can experiment and hear what harmonies are going to work best, and you can try different ones, because the things that seem obvious aren't always the nicest things. Sometimes you chance upon a chord and a melody that shouldn't really on paper fit, but they do when you perform them. And so the point about this, all I'm going on about, is that harmony is a beautiful thing, and it's about layering one thing on top of another. But if you had a painting, you wouldn't just cover color one on top of the other endlessly. Sometimes you might want the whole of one picture to be blue, different shades of blue. You wouldn't want necessarily to have lots of different colors in there. There's all sorts of ways of thinking of harmony, and I think color is one of them. So my view is to, first of all, start with just a few choices and move things around and listen to those harmonies really carefully. Are they evoking the mood you want to evoke? Are they making the journey of the music follow along logically? Because really good harmony leads you through the music, makes you want the next chord, makes you expect the next thing. And you might have some harmonies that really want to go to a different chord, and you don't allow that to happen. And that can be that interrupted feeling can be also quite evocative when you're writing music. There are so many choices with harmony, and it's just great fun to experiment and move things around, try different harmonies. Even when you've got your chord of C, there are 3 ways of doing C, with C in the bottom, E in the bottom, and G in the bottom, and they all sound different, and they all have a different mood about them. And that's just one chord. So I would just say experiment, because it's great fun, harmony. And you can give a simple tune the most amazing new mood by changing the harmony underneath it.
Another question from Josna is, we're composing music for an animation of In the Hall of the Mountain King by Grieg. Josna asks, what choices do you make about layering sounds to develop texture in your music?
Well, speaking as someone who spent much of the last 5 years putting music on something like 200 animated Mr. Bean films, animation is something I've been doing an enormous amount of, and it's something I think a lot about as well. Because with animation, your music often has a new job, a new role to play that it doesn't have when it's live action, with the scenery behind it. Because, if you have a normal camera shot of a landscape, there's depth and there's a sort of feeling of the landscape as you look at that picture. But an animation, even if it's brilliantly done, is much more two-dimensional. And so that the feeling of that landscape, the depth, if you like, the depth of the lens, the perspective, is something that the music can do for you. If it's a single instrument, you wouldn't have a single instrument without some kind of reverb or echo, which gives you a sense of space. And often when you're working with animated pictures, if it's a picture of a landscape or say a castle in the distance or a river, the music can help you the viewer imagine a much bigger scope than the animated picture is able to do. It can sort of fill in the gaps, if you like, of the grandeur of the feeling of it that you get when you see a great view. So the first thing about layering is that, let's say you have strings playing something and then you bring in a solo instrument above it. The thing you need to try and work on is to create space, because you are actually trying to create an environment that isn't quite so small as an animated environment is. You're trying to create something bigger to reach out into the corners of all the pictures. The other thing about animation is that often there isn't quite as much dialogue as there would be in a scene with two people acting it out. And so the music's job is to help tell the story. But the golden rule is, when you're telling the story with the music, is you should never give away what's about to happen in the music to the audience as they're watching. Never anticipate. You're always going at the same speed as the story, if you see what I mean. Because if something scary is about to happen and you do a little bit of build-up scary music, you're going to spoil the scary shock and alarm. What you actually have to do is time it so that as the viewer sees whatever it is they're seeing, the piece of action or the drama or the wonderful view or a character's face with an emotion on it, as the viewer sees that, the music has to fill in the gaps of all those feelings that you would have because it's animated. And the final thing I'd say about animation is that there's a great deal of detail in how how the picture has been made. Maybe 20 or 30 people have made every detail in those animated pictures come to life. There are certain people who do the backgrounds, there are certain people who do the foregrounds, there are some people who do the characters' faces, some people do the movement, etc., and the color and the light. These are all different jobs, and a huge amount of detail is put into animation. And one of the things we do when we layer either instruments or sounds on top of each other in our orchestration or our arrangement, we are doing the same thing. We're creating lots of different things so that when you look at a picture, there's lots going on, there's lots of interest to hear and to see. And that's why I think the job of music in animation has become so important. And here's the thing. It's interesting, isn't it, that a lot of the biggest animated films of the last 50 years in particular is that their music is an enormous part of them, often songs as well. Some of the most successful things ever, Lion King, is music, not just music and background, it's songs as well and animation. And I think that's an understanding of the fact that animation, however beautiful and brilliant it is, it needs that extra dimension of depth, and music can give it. And when we make layers in music, harmonies on top of each other or instruments piled on top of each other, or whatever it is, when we make layers, we make that a whole big, deep sound and effect.
Fantastic, thank you. So insightful, and I've just learned a lot. Thank you very much. So Tyrese asks, what are your 3 top tips for composing at GCSE level?
Well, these may not be the same for everybody, of course, because everybody will approach their task differently. My thing is, I always think it's easier if your composition is triggered by or prompted or inspired by something else that isn't musical, whether it's a poem or a thought or an emotion or a story or a painting, whatever it is. If you have something external that you can look to or think about, it sometimes makes it much easier to imagine what the music would be. I mentioned this earlier when I talked about having a big blank page. That's the most scary thing of all. But if someone says to you, here's this picture, this view, could you imagine a piece of music that would fit that picture? Or here are these words, this poem, how can you imagine what the music would be for them? That's a very good starting point because you're already on the way. And I think the second thing I'd say leads on from that, which is that even now, I've been composing for all these years, starting is the most difficult bit. And the important thing is to just start. It doesn't matter if what you start with, you're later going to revise or chuck out or shorten or go back to a new idea. It doesn't matter. It's really important to start, to get the page going, whether it's on a computer or whether it's on your music paper or at the piano, whatever it is, get going. And what I do, if I'm finding it difficult to sort of work out what the music should be for something, I just start with anything that comes first into my head. And I start working around it and I experiment a bit and I think about it. And as time goes on, it might be hours or it might be days working on it, at some point, something will click. And then you'll see, that's how this works. That's the right piece of music for this. That's the right mood. And then you can go back and fix all the things that you were experimenting with to start with that didn't fit with that. And you can go back and it's much easier to revise and tweak something than it is to start from scratch because you've got, I know this bit really works. So now I know that works. That's the right mood. That's the right feeling. That's the right kind of harmony I want. Now I've got to go back to the bit where I started and I was just doodling around and I wasn't quite sure. And now I know what to do with that. And that's what I do even now. Never mind when you're doing GCSE. It's the same rule. Just get started. And even if you know the stuff you're starting with isn't what you're going to end up with, or it isn't going to be your perfect work, that doesn't matter. You will get there in the process of writing and composing. And the third thing I would say is that, with music, there are right and wrong answers to some extent, but quite a lot about music is a journey which you go on and that you find out what works as you do it. Pretty much everything I've done, there are one or two examples where I've thought of something, but the theme tune to the Vicar of Dibley, for example, I thought of immediately when I went to meet the people who are doing it and I read the script. I said, it should be a setting of the Psalm 23, and it's going to sound like this. But that's very rare. Normally, people would say to you, here's what you've got to write, this is what we're doing, this is the stories, the characters, and you would think about it for quite a long time. Then you start working and the first thing you do isn't quite right, and no, that rhythm isn't quite there, but I'll just keep going. And you find on that journey the way to the music. And it's true of almost every aspect of it. It's true about what the instrumentation should be, if it's sung, how it should be sung, what kind of voice, what kind of sound would that be? Is it more than one voice? You discover these things. The music eventually starts to tell you what it needs. So in a way, I would say, trust the process, trust your instinct, and trust that the music will come flowing when you've cracked what it is that is going to work for you.
Fantastic. Again, thank you so much. I'm going to go into a bit of a personal question. Mm-hmm. So everyone's got their favourite pieces of music, and I'd love to know what your 3 desert island discs would be.
It's very cruel to ask for just 3, Jenetta. Okay, I'm going to say 3 with a 4th because I can't nail it down. Fine. So Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life, which I guess a lot of your younger viewers may not know, but people of my age, it was such a masterpiece and so inspiring, and so many different musical styles in one piece of work. Absolutely extraordinary, magnificent double album by Stevie Wonder back in the 70s. So that's one of them, please. Carole King did an album even earlier than that, in the 1960s, called Tapestry. It's the most beautiful set of songs, quite simply done with piano and vocal and a bit drums and bass, very simple arrangements, beautiful songs by a fantastic songwriter. And it just shows that simplicity and clarity and sincerity are so often the best things about songwriting. And so that would be one of my desert island discs. I would also have Johann Sebastian Bach's Matthew Passion, which I think is the most magnificent piece of choral music anyone's ever come up with. And it's just fabulous. And I would have the Beatles' Abbey Road album as well. Now, I know all those are from a long time ago, but you did ask my desert island discs, and the thing is that in a way they've gone through my whole life, and I've always dipped back into them. And isn't it interesting that, you know, even now, 50 years later, people are still, young musicians are still being inspired by Stevie Wonder's music from 40 or 50 years ago. They're still being inspired by what the Beatles did. I mean, all musicians who appreciate good music, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. After all, Bach is 350 years ago. And, you know, we still think, well, fantastic stuff he wrote. I mean, I've got lots of other ones to add, by the way, but if you make me do 4, that's what I'll do.
3 plus a bonus answer. That's great. And I think your answer really speaks to the fact that listening plays such a vital role in what you go on to create, because it's easy just to sit at the piano or to sit at the computer and think, right, I've just got to create something. But actually, starting with a period of time just to listen and think about what you'd like to incorporate is so important. So thank you for that.
I think, Jenetta, that's really important. And, you know, when I was talking about how do you start with your composing, it's perfectly okay to start imitating the things you like. That's what I did when I started. I just wrote like the people I liked. I said, oh, that sounds good. I wish I could do that. And the thing is, you needn't worry about it too much, because what happens is when you start to do an imitation of someone, it actually turns into you. And it's actually, I can tell you this as a professional who's done it as a job, really imitating someone else very, very cleverly, like a pastiche, is actually very difficult. And it's what actually happens is you start writing, you think you're writing a song like Stevie Wonder, and no one else hears the song you're writing that sounds like Stevie Wonder. It doesn't matter. It'll sound like you, and it will sound like all the things you like. And I think, especially when you start out, but it never really stops, is that you hear something, you say, God, that's brilliant. I wonder how they're doing that. And then you investigate that, you listen to it, as you say. But there's no harm in trying to do your version of it. No harm at all. It's a good way of learning.
Thank you so much. And we're about to close. And the final question is one that's another personal one for you. What's your proudest achievement professionally?
Well, that's really difficult, Jenetta, because sometimes the things you do that you enjoy most or that you've got learned most from aren't necessarily the thing that's the most popular. You can't judge that. You can never second guess what an audience will think. And sometimes you write a whole musical with 20 songs in it, and the one you like best is not the one everybody else likes best. You just can't guess what people will like about you and how they'll respond to your music. I think one of my career highlights, I'm not going to say it's necessarily the absolute one, but one of them was a very proud thing, which is I got involved in the music of the opening ceremony of the London 2012 Games. And that was an incredibly proud thing to do. And it was very hard work and very complicated and rather nerve-wracking. And I did this sketch with Rowan, where he was playing with the London Symphony Orchestra, the Chariots of Fire theme. And it was a kind of funny sketch, but it was happening live with an orchestra and film. And we had to have a running track underneath it, like a backing track. And I had to reconstruct the Chariots of Fire theme with all the original synthesizers that Vangelis used, and all those kind of things. It was a very complicated technical job to do, but also a tremendous privilege. And I think a lot of us who sat there on opening night of the ceremony were very nervous about how it would go down. And I think most of the people I worked with on that, and the vast number of people who were drawn in to work on the opening ceremony for Danny Boyle, who put it all together, I think we were all just doing it like for love, because we didn't want it to be rubbish in front of the whole world. And we were all sitting there very nervously on that night about whether it would go down okay. And it was just I was so proud that beautiful opening ceremony, which made us all feel very united, I think, and harmonious and kind of at ease with ourselves. It seems like a long time ago, Jenetta, now, because it seems like we're not in that same place now. But certainly on that night, when we did that opening ceremony, I think we all felt it was a highlight for all of us who worked on it, a real highlight, and something we could do for our country. And it was just rather wonderful.
That's a really beautiful point to end on. And it was well received, and it was an amazing moment for the country. So thank you for your contribution, and thank you for sharing your time with us. It's just an absolute privilege and an honour to have this time with you, and I'm looking forward to hearing, the feedback from the young people and the teachers up and down the UK that get to experience hearing from you. So thank you so much, Howard.
You're very welcome, Jenetta, and it's very nice talking to you and to all those people out there who'll see this in their schools.
Thank you.